Good morning, Trinity family. Welcome to another installment of the Midweek Check-In series. I hope you're all having a good week. I'm coming to you from an extremely rainy Thursday morning this morning. I'm hoping it lightens up a little bit later on today. But I guess for those of us that like rain, it's going pretty well so far today. What am I going to talk to you all about this week? Well, Pastor Benson is preaching this week, and I don't know what direction he's going to take with his sermon this week. I haven't talked to him about it, but at our text study that we had this week with the other Butler area Lutheran pastors that we have every week, we looked at the readings this week, and there's a very strong theme of forgiveness throughout our readings for this week, right? There's the Genesis story about Joseph reuniting with his brothers and forgiving them for having sold him into slavery so many years before. And then in the gospel reading, Jesus is talking at length about the need to forgive others, and if you don't forgive others, then you're not truly a follower, and if you only forgive those who are your close friends or family, how is that different than those who are not followers of our God, so on and so forth. Jesus talks about those things at length. And so we talked a lot about forgiveness, and the conversation with the other pastors then went in a lot of different directions, which is a healthy thing, exploring how those themes fit into everyday life in a lot of different avenues. And the example that popped into my mind is one that pops into my mind a lot, to the point where one of the other pastors commented, that's not the first time you've brought that up here. The example that popped into my mind is the example of driving. I seem to tend to talk a lot about driving in the context of a study group or a Christian education group. When we start talking about human behavior, the discussion of driving ends up being on the table an awful lot for me. And one of the other pastors joked about it and said, "You talk about driving in here repeatedly." Well, that's because I feel like on the road, I think that driving is an excellent study in human behavior. I think we learn a lot about a person's true colors on the road. People tend to show you a lot of who they really are when they're driving, for better or for worse. And myself included, sometimes the not-so-savory parts of our human nature can come out when we're driving. There's something about the art of driving that causes us to behave in ways that we might not if we had to look the other person in the eyes, right? There's something that is too easily dehumanizing about the way in which, you take your frustrations out on another driver and you cut somebody else off, and it's easier to do when we don't have to look them in the eye, right? And myself included, I will admit that I lose my temper every now and then, and I've done it too, and I'm then ashamed seconds after I've done it, but I will admit that I do it, as most of us have done it. It's all too easy to forget that there's a real human being in the other car, because all you see is the car. You don't have to look them in the eyes, right? And so it becomes easier to treat people in ways we wouldn't if we then had to look them in the eye and talk to them about it afterward. And so I used that example, and then we talked about that a little bit further. The other pastors, we all discussed it for a little bit. And, when Jesus calls us to forgive this week, and I think about it in the context of, okay, so this guy on Route 8 just cut me off, and, my tendency is then to behave in ways that aren't particularly Christian. I want to blare my horn at him. I want to get right on his bumper for a few miles. But we take a deep breath, and we calm ourselves, and we remember to live as Jesus called us to live. And maybe we turn the radio up, and the only action that's required is to just lift our foot off the gas a little bit, and don't tailgate them. Don't do that out of frustration. Don't return injury for injury. Forgive and move on. And the group's discussion, as we talked about it in the context of that example, led down a couple different paths, and one of them was this. When Jesus calls us to forgive those who have hurt us, there's a number of reasons we're being called to do that. We're being called to do that so that we might be peacemakers, and we might build up community in the human family, that we might, strengthen bonds and make friendships. But another reason Jesus calls us to do that is for our own good. Jesus calls us to forgive so that we can be liberated from hatred, so that we don't carry around the burden of hate for other people. Because if we carry around anger in our hearts all the time, it just saps us of life. It deprives us of the privilege of living abundantly that Jesus gives us. Jesus wants us to live our best life. And that is a life that is filled with joy and love and service. And that life is just sapped away when we go around carrying anger and hate for other people. Jesus wants us to be freed from that. And so that's one of the many reasons why we're called to forgive others when we're hurt. So the next time somebody cuts you off on the highway and you're struggling to keep your anger under control, and I've been there, we all do it. Let us remember the way that Jesus called us to live, and that he doesn't just call us to live that way for the benefit of others. He also calls us to live that way for ourselves. Jesus calls us to forgive others so that we may be freed and liberated from that tendency to live in anger towards others that so many folks of the world do live with all the time. And Jesus calls us to be better than that. Jesus calls us to be freed from that because he wants us to live abundantly. So let us remember that the next time we're having trouble keeping our temper under control, whether that's on the road or wherever else it is in life. That's what I've got for you this week, folks. I will see you all in worship this weekend. Have a good week. God bless.